Times obituaries in November 2011 and saw the obituary of Svetlana Alexievna. And it ended with a quotation from Svetlana in which she said, "No matter where I go, to an island, to Australia, wherever, I will always be the political prisoner of my father's name." And I thought, oh my God, how do you live under the shadow of such a name, and what would that life be? So I was calling my editor in New York, the extraordinary Claire Wachtel. I have the two best editors in the world, Iris Tupple here at HarperCollins in Canada, and Claire Wachtel in New York. And I said, "Claire, what do you think?" And she said, "You can do it." So I had to give her a 20-page proposal within 5 days. But I had grown up on the Russians as we all did. I read Mandelstam, Solzhenitsyn, Akhmatova, etc. And I had actually visited the Soviet Union as a student, well, after I graduated from university, in 1979, in the high communist days, and found it astonishingly mysterious, inaccessible, a closed society, and this is where Svetlana had come from. So I began to do my research. And as a trained biographer, you do first, you use that marvelous legislation which they have in the United States, the IOFA, the Freedom of Information Act, and you ask the FBI for the files. Then you get the CIA to send you the files. Then you hire a researcher to do the State Department files, and then you get the libraries, Princeton, Yale, etc. I just love the idea of my postman coming, there'd be an address, CIA, FBI, and I never gave him an explanation. By the time I was finished, I had 10 drawers, file drawers, full of documents. But the first thing you do when you're doing a biography is you approach the literary executor, and in this case that would have been Svetlana's daughter. Stalin's granddaughter lives in the United States. It was with some trepidation that I contacted her. I knew that she was born in 1971, so the woman I was meeting in those days was a 42-year-old woman who had, of course, never met her grandfather. I flew to Portland and I found this extraordinary American girl. She was everything you love about Americans. Direct, forthright, scrupulous, wonderfully open-minded, and her favorite thing to do, amateur, was stand-up comedy. We sat down and I had sent her previously my biography of Elizabeth Smart, and she said, "Well, I guess you're going to do this, and if you're going to do it, you better have my mother's voice in that book." So she gave me permission to quote from all unpublished letters, biography, letters, Svetlana's own books and so on, so I knew I would have the voice. The next thing I did was visit the International Spy Museum in Washington, D.C. There had been a podcast with Bob Rail, who was the CIA agent who helped Svetlana to defect from India. And again, that was an extraordinary experience because Bob Rail turned out to be her most powerful advocate. Svetlana had a life that is impossible to imagine any of us surviving. And surviving with the kind of spirit she had. She had a poignant and heartbreaking side. I remember sitting in my hotel room with Svetlana's daughter, who was called Olga, when she was born. Now Chris, sitting with Chris, and as the room darkened, Chris said, "You know, there were moments when my mother could fall into the night terrors of a child, and you didn't know what precipitated it." And yet at the same time, here was this woman with an indomitable will, a degree of anger that only a Russian can have, and even a sense of humor that kept her going as a nomad her time in the United States, she lived in 30 different apartments and residencies. She returned to the Soviet Union. She redefected for 2 years, realized this was a bad idea. Luckily, Gorbachev came to power and she was able to leave. And she just kept, with a quality of will that was astonishing. So as I went back to her childhood, when Svetlana was 6.5, her mother committed suicide, though she did not know it was suicide. She was told her mother had appendicitis, and what does a 6-year-old understand? When she was 11, her favorite aunt and uncle were arrested by her father during the years of the terror at the end of the 30s and were executed 2 years later. When she was 16, she fell in love, as only a 16-year-old can, platonically, romantically, extremely, with a filmmaker called Alexei Kapler. Papa didn't approve and had him arrested and sent to the Gulag for 10 years. You imagine the guilt that a child, a 16-year-old would feel. Then when she was in the late 40s, when she was in her early 20s, her aunts started to disappear. Aunt Anna and Aunt Senya and her cousin Kira were sent off to Lubyanka into solitary confinement. Each time the family closed ranks, trying to figure out how this could happen. After Stalin died in 1953, when she expected a liberation, things did not improve. As you know, Khrushchev had a brief thaw, which didn't last, and under Brezhnev, several of her friends at the Gorky Institute, particularly Sinyavsky and Yuri Daniel, were sentenced for publishing their books in the West to 7 years in the Gulag. And the final blow was when her lover, her husband, whom she hadn't been allowed to marry because Stalin's daughter should not be marrying an Indian man from Uttar Pradesh, even though he was the son of a Raj. She wasn't allowed to marry Brezhnev Singh, but was allowed, after he died, to take his ashes back to India. So a kind of image of Stalina's life is, as she flew on a plane, she couldn't have the man sit up beside her, she could have his urn. It was that made her say, enough. And she impulsively defected to the United States, walking into the US Embassy. They were very kind to her. Ambassador Bowles said, well, how long do you have? And she says, about 4 hours before the Soviets discover I'm missing because they're having a party and everybody will be drunk. But Bowles decided to request to discover her bona fides in Washington, and the CIA, FBI, and State Department all wrote back. They had no information on Svetlana. They didn't even know Stalin had a daughter. That was how thorough the information was. And so she got on a plane, bound for Rome, supposedly going to the United States, and then a cable came from Feuchtwanger, who was the under Secretary of State in the Johnson administration, saying, had nothing to do with her, kick her out. And her experience in the United States, in the West, was not that different from the experience as Stalin's daughter in the Soviet Union. By which I mean that she was surrounded by murderousness and tragedy in the Soviet Union, but subject to bureaucracy. And in the West, she was also constantly the victim, if you want, of being seen as Stalin's daughter. If she got angry, it must be Stalin in her, etc. But in the end, I think she made $1.5 million from her manuscript, which she was carrying. She called it her little manuscript. Editors bought it without reading it because it was by Stalin's daughter. And then she lost it all because money did not mean anything to a Russian or a Soviet. She married a man called Wesley Peters, who was an architect at the Taliesin Foundation, who had been steered into this marriage by Olga Vanna Reich, the widow of Frank Lloyd Wright, who needed money for her foundation. And soon the money was gone. But out of that came, I think, the salvation of Svetlana's life, her daughter, Olga. And it was her attachment to Olga that made it possible for her to survive all these extraordinary crises. In the course of writing this book, I went to Russia, to Georgia, to England, through the United States. I interviewed 40 different people, and the portrait you have of Svetlana is cumulative from all those interviews. I do want to tell you what it's like for me, as a biographer, what it was like to visit Russia in June of 2012. I rented an apartment. I had my husband with me because I was told don't go alone with a man, and two of my researchers. And the fourth night we were there, we got a phone call at midnight saying the police wanted to get into the apartment. All right, this is a home invasion, this is the real thing. We called the landlord called the police. We went outside and waited till 2:30 in the morning. Finally, the police came with the suspect so that they could videotape her account of the murder they were accusing her of that had occurred in our apartment 3 months earlier. As lead detective Lermontov came up to apologize for the lateness of the hour, though he had told the landlord if nobody was home, they'd break the door down. As he apologized for the lateness of the hour, the cops behind him were laughing. And what were they saying? In the old days, we didn't need to apologize. And that was a symptom of my trip. I am going to read you just one short paragraph so that you get the feel of the book. And I'm picking it, I suppose, because it has something of Stalin's voice. Nadia, Stalin's wife, committed suicide when her daughter was 6.5, when her son was 11. I think there was no way out for her. There was no way of escaping Stalin. Pravda reported Nadia's death in a perfunctory manner without explanation. Her suicide was a state secret, though everyone in the apparatus knew about it. The children, along with the public, were told another story. Nadia had died of peritonitis. It would be 10 years before Svetlana learned the truth. Though this might seem astounding, it's entirely credible. The terror that Stalin had begun to spread around him particularly infected those closest. Who would dare tell Stalin's daughter, that her mother had committed suicide? Many would be shot simply for knowing the truth. It became bad form soon to even mention Nadia's name. Stalin was clearly shocked by Nadia's death. He wrote his mother, "Greetings, mother, dear. I got the jam, the ginger, and the Georgian candy. The children are very pleased. Keep well, dear mother, keep your spirits up. The children value you. After Nadia's death, my private life has been very hard, but a strong man must always be valiant." But for very young children, the scars caused by a parent's death are profound, in part because death is something their young minds can't grasp. They understand only abandonment. The childhood friend, 7-year-old Martha Peshkova, granddaughter of the famous writer Maxim Gorky, remembered visiting Svetlana after Nadia's death. Svetlana was playing with her dolls. There were scraps of black fabric all over the floor. She was trying to dress her dolls in the black fabric and told Martha, "It's Mommy's dress. Mommy died. I want my dolls to be wearing my mommy's dress."